Good morning, everyone. Hope you had a lovely weekend. Before I begin today, two quick things. Number one, the grades for the final quiz, which was due last night, of course. I hope they'll be updated on Canvas at some point later this week, so be on the lookout for that. And number two, reminding you that your final project is fast approaching, and I would highly encourage you not to wait to the last minute. And if you need my help, then I'm here to help you with any questions you may have. But let's try and not do that in the last minute. So use the office hours and just log in on Tuesday or Wednesday, whenever your office hours is, and come and talk to me. There's the Friday in-person meetings to do that as well if you're interested in coming. And just be in touch with me. Let's not get to the last week of the semester and then try to do everything rushed. Okay, this week we'll begin a new topic talking about international terrorism. But as always, beforehand, quick review on Wednesday last week. I completed the discussion about territorial disputes, but focusing mostly on motivations, what makes those kinds of issues so important to us that it's likely to lead to an aggressive, to violence and to disputes. First, we talked about the fact that even though territorial issues may be good for politicians in terms of generating public support, they can also have substantial political costs. When we talked about the cost that some of the Israeli governments have paid when they went into territorial wars. Then we talked a little bit about the evolutionary approach to this issue by mostly providing us with some context about rational approach that explains the behavior of different sides of those kinds of interactions, those intruders and the holders or the residents of the territory, how that fits beyond even the just individual point of view, but that how it fits also within the way that the animal kingdoms operates. Then we invoke the issues that goes a little bit beyond rationality, such as strong ties to the territory based on the fact that I'm the historical owner. So the several experiments in China that show that whenever we're invoking those kinds of ideas, then the probabilities of concessions is much lower. The idea of spatial proximity, those that far away from the territory place a lot more value on its political importance, therefore they're less likely to accept concessions. They adopt a view which is a little bit away from the rational standpoint compared to those that live very close to those territories, so they're concerned about potential conflict. And finally, based on the experiment, the conjoint experiment in Israel, we were able to separate and show that there's both tangible aspects to territory as well as intangible aspects. And in some cases, those intangible values are so strong that they may lead individuals to forego any kind of rational process in the sense of the tangible cost of holding to those territories, and still paying costs on holding those territories, but still unwillingness to compromise over them. So if you want to talk about it more, as always, you are more than welcome to come and talk to me. This week, we're going to talk about, as I said, international terrorism. I'll begin by presenting some conceptual issues regarding the concept of terrorism. What is terrorism? How do we define this kind of phenomena? And then we'll go kind of a theoretical journey that will provide us with different explanations for the motivations of individuals to engage or to support acts of terrorism. So the first question we address in this case is terrorism that much of a threat in reality? While it is very prevalent in news reporting, terror events are not very frequent, especially when it comes to the United States and the Western world. So what you see on your screen now are data from one of the largest terrorism databases. And you can see, for example, that from the years 2017, 2018, overall, the data suggests that the United States had 133 reported incidents, but the vast majority of those incidents fit to what we view in many cases as domestic terrorism. They were perpetrated by mostly white supremacist groups. And only 7 of those incidents fit with what we intuitively see as international terrorism incidents. And for those 7 attacks, just to get you some context, there were 15 fatalities and 25 injuries, when the main attack is an October 2017 ramming attack in New York City, which ended with 8 dead and 13 injuries. And when we look back on the data at 2012, we see 15 incidents. So overall, we see a very low number of attacks. And when we consider that data and also think about the size of the American population, then that means that the actual risk of being a victim of terror incident is very, very small, maybe even insignificant. And that leads us to think, first and foremost, about this quote made by John Mueller, which is one of the experts when it comes to national security and terrorism, saying that if those terror operatives are that determined to come and attack the United States, then either they're not trying very hard because they're not here, or they're not as common as we think. Essentially, he's saying maybe this threat that sometimes in the news seems so prominent is not really that much of a threat. Let's think about it a little bit more, but looking a little bit more by checking some more data. This is a table from a textbook that I'm using for my international terrorism class, but what you see in this table is the likelihood of being a terror victim in the United States compared to other ways that you may die. So for that matter, the way we interpret this table is that you're 87 times more likely to die from drowning than from being a victim of terror attacks in the United States. You are 353 more times more likely to die from falling than being a victim of a terrorism attack. Again, emphasizing the aspect that this is not that much of a threat in the context of the United States, especially. Here we have the number and the percentage of transnational attacks against American interests every year. And we see overall that there is a downward trend in data, whether it is the number of incidents, which is the bold line, or the percentage of them in the dashed line. Overall, we see this a drop in the number of attacks on American assets. And over the last 15 years or so, 20 years or so, there are still attacks that target American interests, but most of them are actually targeting American interests abroad. And one of the main reasons for that is ever since 9/11, the United States has invested heavily in protection of the American continent, including acts such as the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security and fortifying a lot of the American aspects that relate to government or even civilian targets here in the United States. So terrorists, for that matter, still tried to attack American assets, but they did that not here, but in other places around the world. So when we look at this type of data, that may lead us to wonder, especially in the American context, why should we even care about terrorism? And even for our specific discussion, why do we need to study that? Why do we need to spend the time, spend the energy to build those theoretical arguments and explain to us what leads individuals to adopt those kinds of acts, and to spend the time to collect data, to test the data, when we talk about such a rare type of an event? So there's a couple of reasons we can think about. First, it is a political tactic that kills many people and causes a significant number of physical injuries and traumatic experiences. So while the numbers in the Western world, and primarily in the United States, are much lower across the globe, there is a substantial increase in the number of terror attacks. Similarly, when it comes to casualties, fatalities, an increase in the number of casualties and fatalities around the globe, especially in the last 10 years or so. So even though that's not in our backyard, that still matters. Second, and related to that, terrorism is a global phenomenon. What we see in those pie charts is the distribution of transnational terror incidents by different regions of the world. On the left-hand side, we have the last 30-something years of the 20th century, and then from 2002 all the way through the last couple of years. So we saw the substantial decrease in the number of attacks when it comes to the United States. And we see it here. NA stands for North America, goes from 6% to 1%. But at the same time, we can look at MENA, which represents the Middle East and North Africa, which was about 70% of the incidents in the end of the 20th century, and doubled in size to 35% of the incidents ever since then. So this is an event, a tragic event, which is prevalent around the globe, even if it's not here. Third, those are tragic experiences. Many of you may not be old enough to remember the events of 9/11 in the United States, but you're familiar with that. I'm pretty certain that you're more familiar with the event of the Boston Marathon bombing. This is one of the most common types of unfortunate pictures that were prevalent in Israel during the early years of the 2000s, when the second Intifada was raging, and terrorists have focused on attacks on civilian population in Israel almost every day, with a lot of civilian casualties. And just so we'll remember that those tragic experiences are not unique to citizens in the Western world. This is a funeral in Pakistan after the Taliban has targeted a school and killed over 120 children in an attack in 2014, I think. So around the globe, this is a tragic experience for individuals, for citizens of different countries. We should care about that. And finally, we do care. The public do care. This is a Gallup survey from early 2018 here in the United States. And as you can see, international terrorism is one of the top threats among the respondents of that survey. And this is prevalent over the years. And you can say 2018 is almost 20 years past 9/11. It's still a prevalent threat that the American public cares about. There have been studies conducted and surveys conducted around the globe that tested those similar questions that showed that those kinds of that the importance of terrorism is prevalent in many countries around the globe. So we can understand, and that's what I hope that this introduction has made it clear to you, that even though this is a very rare event, even though the threat here in the United States is very, 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 very small, that's still an issue which is critical when it comes to foreign policy, international relations, events that are happening around the world. So we should care about that. We should also learn about it more and try to understand it better. So the first thing we're going to do in order to understand it better is to take a more of a research approach to that and ask, what is terrorism? Why do we need a definition? If we're staying in our area of trying to learn about that and research those kinds of topics, if we want to conduct a systematic analysis of terror incidents, so we can make comparison between cases and see this is terrorism, this is not terrorism, we must have a clear definition of what constitutes a terror incident. And this is a very, very complex endeavor for that matter, because what you have here on your screen, this is part of a quote from some famous individual that according to his view, if the cause is just and it's primarily the fight for the freedom of liberation of land and people, then this is not, should be, that those kinds of actions should not be viewed as terrorism. Now, if we were in class now, which we unfortunately aren't, I would have tried to ask you, who do you think said those kinds of things? And you probably had some ideas. I doubt that you had the right person in mind here, probably because you wouldn't have thought about the context of that individual. And that's Yasser Arafat, the former head of the Palestinian terror organizations, the PLO, which later became the president, the first leader of the Palestinian Authority. According to his view, if the motivation is justified, then that's not terrorism. And that provides us a hint to the challenge of defining terrorism, because you're probably familiar with the most famous saying, a one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. And that's essentially encapsulates some of that problem. Let's think about it also by reviewing some of the official definitions. And with that, I'm going to go back to the book and give you some story time points. For example, the United Nations definition of terrorism focuses on the outcomes, saying that any person commits an offense within the meaning of this convention, causes death or serious bodily injury, serious damage to public or private property, damage to property, places, facilities, blah, blah, blah. So the United Nations definition focuses on outcomes. For many of the American departments, such as the Department of Defense and Department of Justice, the focus is actually on the objectives of those perpetrators or the motives. So, for example, this is the definition, or part of the definition, from the Department of Defense and the FBI. International terrorism means activities that meeting the following three characteristics: involve violent acts dangerous to human life, appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce the civilian population, to influence policy, and third is occur primarily outside the territorial jurisdiction of the United States, and there's a lot more here. So that's a different approach, or a slightly different approach to what is terrorism. And the third that I have here is a 2014 law that was passed in Saudi Arabia. And according to that law, terrorism is any act carried out by an offender, I'm sorry, directly or indirectly intended to disturb the public order of the state, or to shake the security of society, or the stability of the state, or to expose its national unity to danger, or to suspend the basic law of governance or some of its articles, and it goes on and on. What I'm trying to say here, you don't need to memorize those definitions, of course. You can see between different official definitions, the language vary, but it's important as to understand what are the implications of those kinds of definitions. So if we go back to this last one I talked about, the Saudi one, it is described in a pretty much abstract or a vague way. And it provides the government a lot of freedom to apprehend or to arrest many suspects that engage in actions that the government or this specific law views as terrorism, but we intuitively will not see as terrorism, right? Disturb the public order of the state. It's a very vague way to talk about it. So that's one thing we need to remember also when it comes to official definition. And another complicating factor when we talk about defining this phenomenon, despite those differences on those official definitions that we talked about and the way that we intuitively think about that, and we talk about other aspects of that in a few minutes, there is one common element in a lot of the definitions of terrorism, and that's the adoption of irregular means trying to accomplish political goals or political outcomes. Yet, one of the main challenges when it comes to defining terrorism, and that hints back to the quote that I just gave you in the previous slide from Arafat, is the idea that some interpretations of terrorism place a lot of value on the legitimacy of the act. Legitimacy is a very subjective and inconsistent concept because what I may view as legitimate may not be viewed as legitimate by another individual. Because legitimacy is such a contested concept, a contested element of any definition, a scientific approach to study terrorism cannot rely on it, primarily because it will complicate the analysis and it will make comparisons between cases very, very hard, as well as what data we collect, what are the conditions for that fit our research. As an example, if I think that some act is legitimate, then I will not view that incident as terrorism. It's not going to be part of my data. But if my colleague or any one of you that also conduct this kind of research see the same incident, the same act as illegitimate, you will say, yes, it is terrorism. That should be part of the data. So we cannot actually compare my research with your research because we don't share the same view on the phenomena. In order to avoid from those all kind of obstacles, what researchers and scholars do is to focus their definition on clear and objective aspects of terrorism. So this is an example for one way to think about that. Those are 5 characteristics of terrorism, and the reason that I'm talking about these, in that they are objective characteristics and they can be viewed. We can observe them. Legitimacy, we cannot view legitimacy, right? So first is the existence of violence, which is not complicated. Perpetrators, there's a focus on non-state actors, even though this kind of definition complicates the idea of state-sanctioned violence or state-sponsored terrorism, which we're not going to talk about. Sorry. Third is the targets, focus on non-combatants, right? Those are the targets of terrorism, not soldiers that are in battle. But if we combine those two aspects, what about uniformed military personnel, which are not in a combat setting? What about a member of the Marine Corps, which comes back from deployment and is still in uniform, but that individual is now boarding the train in New York City and is being attacked by an individual or a group who kill him or injure him? Is it terrorism or not? This is still a complicating factor, even though those kinds of characteristics are supposed to be much clearer. Another important aspect that scholars are heavily rely on is the idea that having a psychological effect of the act, creating fear, anger, and the idea is that the target of those psychological effects are not just the victims themselves, but a wider audience. So it's not just this, if we stay with the example of the Marine individuals that was attacked, it's not just that individual, but a wider audience. And third is the act must have explicit political objective. That may be the removal of government, that may be the fight over territory, the fight over different rights. It doesn't matter what the political objective is for that matter, but there has to be an explicit one, because this feature is a critical one because it allows us to distinguish terrorism from other forms of violence such as crime. Crime doesn't have a clear political objective. One definition that I like to use, especially when I do my international terrorism course, is this one offered by Chenoweth and Moore. And if you read that, you will see all those 5 characteristics within this definition. All right. The final group we want to account for, we talked about official definitions. We talked about the definitions by scholars. The last ones are the public. Why do we care about the way the public views terrorism? First of all, the public is the #1 target for terrorists. So the way that they think about that matters. The way that individuals, members of the public, citizens, define terrorism in their mind affects their views on what is the appropriate way to address that. And that can have an effect on policy because they will support different candidates, they'll support different policy actions. It matters. To study that, in order to understand that, we'll rely on the work by Huff and Kurtzer. And they suggested that the public definitions of terrorism, the public views of terrorism incident, is based on actually two causal pathways. The first is the objective one, which is very similar to the way that I talked about, the way that scholars view terrorism, is what they call objective approach, and that's the facts on the ground. Those revolve a lot of immediate information, mostly descriptives in types, the method of the attack, the severity of the attack, how many people died, information about the targets, whether it was civilians or not civilians. Those are objective facts. But the other path is the more subjective nature, the why and the who. The motivation of the actor, who is the actor. This type of information is mostly indirect and is delayed. We don't know it right away. When we know about the attack, it's not like in the next 10 minutes we'll know it was that individual representative of that group and he wanted to get this. It usually takes a little longer to learn those kinds to learn this type of information. Now, in order to test those kind of different factors and how they will shape public views of different incidents, they used it should be your favorite method because we talked about it so much, conjoint experiment. And what they wanted to do is to test how those different factors affect the way that the public views different violent incidents and whether they fit to what we think about as terrorism. So for example, this is an objective factor, the method used. And reminding you again, the way we interpret those figures is that everything above the zero, larger than zero, is a positive effect. Everything under zero is negative effect. And here we compare those different methods. So compared to protest, hostage taking is more likely to be viewed as a terror incident. Bombing is the one method which is the most likely to be viewed. If you read about an incident which includes a bombing, it's the one that you're most likely will say, yes, this fits to what I think of as terrorism. That's an example of an objective factor. How about the actor? An individual which suffers from some mental issues, the effect here, you see it's smaller than zero, so it's a negative effect. It's not likely to be viewed as a terror incident. But if it's a group with ties to the United States, if it's a group with foreign ties, it's most likely to be viewed as terrorism. How about the motivation? A Christian motivation, not very likely. Muslim, looks like terrorism, but so is right wing. It's pretty much the same size of the effect in this case, as well as left wing, a little bit smaller. Incidents that involve individuals that argue that they were motivated by the religious motivations of Muslims or right-wing ideology, most likely to be viewed by members of the public as terrorism. And finally, in terms of the specific motivation or political objective here, policy change, government throw, everything that we can expect. But one of the interesting findings that they have is that hatred, according to public respondents, is viewed as a motivation for terrorism, which is very, very, very different from official governmental definitions or researchers' definitions, right? None of those groups view hatred as a motivation, as a cause for terrorism. And that's what makes the public distinct in that manner, right? So now that we learned of the challenge of defining the concept, we move to the main part of the discussion today, and that's learning about the causes. This is one of the two largest areas of research when it comes to international terrorism, and that's one of them is what we talk about today, and that's the causes, the motivation. The second is how do we address that, the counter response. That's going to be Wednesday. And we'll do that by following different theoretical approaches. I will provide some context on each one of them, and then as we do in many of those studies, we'll talk about their main assumptions, their implications, and also about the criticism for each one of those approaches. Sorry. All right, let's start with the strategic approach. We talked about a strategic point of view. It's also termed the rational choice approach, the instrumental model. As we talked about, when we talked about in the context of conflict behavior, wars, international bargaining, international economic policies, every interaction between actors is viewed as a game in which all members of the game attempt to accomplish their political goals. The main benefit of this approach, parsimony. It relies on very simple assumptions, which simplify reality, allows us to derive those implications we will get to in a second, and it can be generalized beyond specific context. And you know that because I talked about that when I talked about rational explanations for war, we talked about rational explanations for engaging in sanctions or responding to sanctions. So it can be applied in multiple contexts. For our discussion, terrorism, based on this approach, the decision to engage in terrorism is a calculated choice based on specific objects, which makes it a rational choice. And the idea is to accomplish those goals by paying the minimum possible costs, right? Okay. So let's begin with assumptions. First, the actions of individuals that are members of those game, all of them, are a function of strategic interactions among multiple actors. And each actor in the game will also contemplate the goals and the preferences of their rivals. So for that matter, if I am the terror group now, any decision that I make to engage in different types of actions will also take under consideration what I think will be the actions of the government that I'm fighting against, members of the public, maybe other terror groups. All of that should be viewed through the prism of strategic interaction, right? We also rely on all the rational choice assumptions, which I detailed a lot more when I talked about rational choice in the context of war. Reminding you, for example, we don't care. One example is we don't care where preferences are coming from. We just assume that there are different preferences for individuals. And lastly, I also mentioned the unitary actor, thinking about terror organizations as a single entity. And we even have some evidence that supports that from the popular media. For example, the way that the media describes terror organizations. We're not saying that here members of ISIS or this leader of ISIS, we're saying what ISIS really wants. So we describe them as a single entity, and that makes it easier to think about that. So if we rely on those assumptions, what are some of the implications? First, terrorists will calculate the expected response of their rivals to different types of attacks. And those kinds of calculations, the strategic type of calculations, will be conducted before they engage in their attack. There is a famous example that one of the quotes given by bin Laden back in 2004 saying, all Al-Qaeda has to do is to go to a far place, to a far mountain in the eastern part of Afghanistan, just plant their flag, and it's going to make the American generals and the American army to rush over there to try to fight them. And we'll be able to create them a lot of damages. The idea behind that is that I, as a member of Al-Qaeda, that's what bin Laden says, I think about and I take under consideration what I think the American response is going to be, and that's going to drive part of my decisions to behave, right? So that's one of them. Second is the idea of coercive effectiveness, the ability of terrorists to force their adversaries to make concessions, which for them means maximizing the group's return on their objectives or preferences, mostly by using a costly signal. We're going to engage in attacks, going to create a lot of costs for you, potentially will create costs for us, but that's going to show you that we are serious and we have goals we want to accomplish. We're willing to fight with the Marine Corps or with the American Air Force, but we want to accomplish those goals. That makes it a rational choice for us. And third is the fact that terror organizations will engage in what's called substitution. That is, that they will engage in different types of methods, different types of perpetrators, and that primarily lies on the assumptions of updating in rational choice. Reminding you once again, if I'm engaged in a rational decision process and rational behavior, I will collect information, feedback from the environment, and if that feedback tells me that my behavior does not lead to an effective outcome, I should change my behavior. And that's the idea behind substitution, right? Learning from success and failure from what the environment tells us. And that, from a positive standpoint for terrorists, that says why suicide terrorism has become such a prevalent tool ever since the 1980s. It was very successful. The environment provided us positive feedback. During the Algerian wars in the 1950s, some of the terror groups, the rebel groups over there, changed from relying on male perpetrators to female perpetrators in order to be able to conduct the more efficient types of operations. Many of the attacks that were focusing on the West, Western Europe, and the United States in the 1970s and 80s, because those countries have built those fortifications, that led perpetrators to shift and to substitute their locations to attacking American assets in the Middle East, American assets in Asia. That's the idea of substitution. One clear example you can see from here, and this is the method used by Hamas during the first decade of the 2000s. So the dark line is number of suicide attacks, and the brighter line is the number of rocket launches. And here you can see in those years, 2004, 2005, this is where the substitution takes place. The number of suicide attacks drops substantially, and the number of rocket fires increases. The main reason for that, Israel has built the barrier between the West Bank and Israeli cities, which made it a lot harder for them, less efficient from the terrorist standpoint, to implement their attacks. So they substituted to a different method, right? So that's substitution. Now, nevertheless, there are criticisms on this approach. One, terror organizations are not monolithic. The unitary actor assumption is a very problematic one. Terror organizations consist of multiple members. There's multiple points of view within those groups. So they will suffer from all the common issues that any organization has: management issues, internal conflicts, leadership struggle, all that. Second, and that's a very important one, in essence, terrorism may be viewed as ineffective because if the main objective of terrorists is to lead to concessions by the government they fight against, in many cases we actually have evidence that terrorism is faced with a backlash when the population, instead of pressuring the government for concessions, the public will rally around the government and will oppose the terrorists and their demands even more. So how would that provide a rational explanation to those kinds of actions? And third, despite what I said about getting positive feedback from the environment or negative and changing behavior, terrorists actually in many cases persist in the attacks despite lack of success, especially political success. The Palestinians kept using suicide attacks or rocket launches in the first decade of the 2000s, despite not getting much in terms of political gains. So those are severe problems. And one way, how can we account for them? One way is to think about terrorism from an organizational standpoint. And that's going to be the second approach I want to talk about. Organizational approach has a social perspective on terrorism, and it has a focus on the inner workings of organizations and groups and their interactions with other groups or within the groups themselves. The main difference from this approach, the main difference to the strategic approach, is that the main objective is clear in this case, and that is the survival of the group. And terrorism is considered a tactical innovation to ensure the survival of the group. Essentially, what that approach tells us overall is that if the group is able to identify a different tactical approach which will secure its survival, not terrorism, they should engage in that, right? So that's the main. In the strategic approach, we had different goals that the group was trying to accomplish, mostly political goals. Here we have one clear goal: survival of the group. That's all we care about, right? Some of the assumptions. The first, as I said, organizational survival above all. It's not a strategic goal. It's not a political goal. All actions of the groups are intended to secure that. That means in terms of recruitment, that means in terms of public support, financial support, media coverage, all that is focusing on that objective. Second, and again, that's an important one, not a unitary actor. Groups are fragmented. There's multiple disagreements over the objectives that the group has, over the different methods that they should employ. As an example, in the late 1960s, in the United States, a non-violent left-wing group called the SDS has operated, mostly fighting for the rights of workers, the end of racism, and the end of the war in Vietnam. Now, that group had a lot of internal disagreements, and in 1969, that led to one faction of that group to separate from the group. That was called the Weather Underground. That new group adopted a much more radical approach to their cause, which was on some ways similar to the SDS, but again, a more radical interpretation of that. And they thought that by conducting attacks on government installations in the United States, they'll be able to lead to what their objective was in that time. One of their objectives at the time, as part of the idea to survive as a group, is to lead to a mass popular insurrection. The idea behind this example is that, again, there was not one goal for SDS. There was multiple goals, and that led to the splintering of the group. Third is that groups has to manage their internal conflicts. There's constant instability, and leaders must always be on the lookout for those kinds of internal challenges and potential collapse of the group. What are those assumptions lead us to learn? One, dense organizational environment will lead to more attacks. The idea behind that, when the environment is very, very dense, there's a lot of groups operating in the same area, there's a lot of competition. Groups will engage in outbeating one another in order to ensure their number one goal, survival. If I'm a terror group operating in area X with 100 other organizations, if I want to ensure that I survive, I have to make sure that I get all the funding, all the recruits, and all the public support. How do I do that? I have to outbid the others in terms of the types of actions I'm taking. So that means my actions, because I'm a terror organization, will be a more violent attacks, more lethal attacks, creating more violence. So essentially, the more dense the environment, the more groups operate in the same area, we should have more attacks. Second, according to that approach, terror organizations will target their rivals, but they will also target their competitors, once again, because they're fighting over the same resources. If I'm working as terror organization A and there's also terror organization B, we're fighting over the same recruits, over the same influence, over the same financial support. So some of my attacks will target my competitor organization because that's going to allow me to get more resources. Third, we can have an explanation to why groups will sustain ineffective tactics, right? That was one of the problems of the strategic approach. One, say that this is their calling card. So Hamas was one of the early adopters of using rocket launches, even though, as I said, it was not very efficient in terms of accomplishing political goals. They kept using that because everybody knew that when a rocket is being launched in the south of Israel, that is Hamas. Today, not much so, but that was especially early on. And second is this idea of switching or transaction costs. When a group shifts its main method of attack from suicide bombers to using rocket launches, you have to train the personnel, you have to acquire the material, you have to change a lot of your tactics. That is a costly action. Sometimes it's not worth it for the groups to do that. Fourth, recruitment to the organization will be based on a social process and not a political one. It's not just accomplish those kinds of political goals, but it's actually the social benefits of being a member of a group, not the freedom of people X, but being a member of group Z. That's why I joined this group. And finally, leadership crisis, violence that's going to take place during that time is likely to increase. Why? Because those are phases of instability where different radical members within the groups try to take control, try to engage in a more violent act in order to take control over the organization. And that has also direct implications to counterterrorism. Because if we decide to engage in a counterterrorism method, which is targeted killing, so leader decapitation, killing the leaders of groups, that actually might lead to more violence. What you have here on your screen are results of a research conducted based on data from Israel, and how does engaging in targeted killings led to additional attacks either on military targets, which you have here on the right side, or civilian targets. So what you see here, the more leaders killed, the number of attacks on military assets was lower. So that's an efficient strategy in this case. But at the same time, the more strikes that were targeting leaders of terror organizations, actually there were more attacks on civilian targets. Not that efficient. So if we think about terrorism within this prism of an organizational approach, we should think also very hard whether engaging in those kinds of counterterrorism method, and we'll talk about it a lot more on Wednesday, is an efficient strategy. Right? Okay, so criticism. First, there's limited empirical strong evidence for behavior which involves outbidding during times of competition and all those things that I talked about related to group dynamics. Second, and even more problematic in this case, is the idea of indeterminate outcomes. So I talked about the fact that more competition, more competitive environment leads to more violence. There is another argument within this approach saying that more cooperation between groups also leads to more violence. The main reason is that they can share resources, they can share methods, so they'll be able to generate more successful attacks. So essentially what we're saying according to this point is that more competition will lead to more violence, and less competition, which manifests in more cooperation, also leads to more violence. So if my observed outcome is more violence, how can I know whether it comes from competition or cooperation? That's a problem in terms of how can we falsify either one of those arguments and make this a scientific theory. Now, there's ways to address that, and I'm not going to go into them now because that's a much larger debate. But that provides one of the most important general criticism on this approach, right? So what we can, if we want to summarize the organizational approach, we can argue that it does offer very strong explanation. At the same time, it has its own set of problems, just like I mentioned now. And one more problem for this approach is we can understand how organizations operate, but we don't know why organization X is more radical than organization Y. Why do individuals mobilize to organization A and not organization B? Which means we also have to look at the individual levels of analysis. We started from a strategic approach, which is kind of fit with the systematic level of analysis. Then I talked about the organizational approach, which is more of a group level of analysis. And now we shift to the individual. To do that, we talk about the ideological approach, a particular belief that serves as motivation to join or to engage in terrorism. Now, one of the first problems that we have before we even go into that explanation is the definition of terrorism. The definition of ideology. We talked about the definition of terrorism. There may be different aspects of ideology. Because it's not clear what represents ideology and what does not represent ideology, it's much easier for us, for members of the government, for the terrorists themselves to adopt this ideology instead of just relying on a politically driven argument, right? So even though this, at the same time, even though this is a very complicated issue, all terror groups operate based on some kind of extreme ideology, and we should study that. The main question we want to address in this case is how does a belief system will regulate and motivate behavior so that some individuals will become or support terrorism. To do that, we'll talk about the different particular aspects of the approach in a second. First, I want to talk a little bit about the most dominant type of ideologies based on two different categories, one the secular, then the religious one. Beginning with the secular category, it might come as a surprise to you, but secular ideologies were the most prevalent ideologies for terrorism over the last 150 years. And there's a lot of subcategories between that. For example, within that. For example, the Marxism extremists, which was an ideology that's very prevalent in the 20th century. It was based loosely on Marx philosophy, the call for revolutions, but those exploited by the system. And violence was viewed as the main tool that groups used to change the existing social order, based on the idea that Marx has offered in his work about workers' revolt against the system, taking control over the means of production. Many groups that relied on that ideology has operated in Europe during the 1970s and 1980s. Another subgroup within this secular category is the fascists or the supremacist extremists. According to that ideology, it promotes the establishment of a military citizenry controlled by a very powerful authoritarian leader. This is an ideology which glorifies violence, masculinity, and racial supremacy, which means there's some kind of a natural hierarchy within society. And studies that focus on those kinds of groups have shown that they tend to be a lot more violent, those that follow the supremacist, fascist ideology. Finally, an approach which does not necessarily rely on the social structure of society, but on more of the national composition of society, and that's the national separatist ideology. It's a post-colonial view which focuses on the struggle of individuals to secure the rights of self-determination, and violence in this case is used to redeem the oppressed. This was one of the main ideologies that guided some organizations that operated in Israel, Palestinian organizations, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. That was the one example. ETA, which is a Basque terror organization that operated in northern Spain, fought for the self-determination of people in the Basque region in northern Spain and southern France. We're more familiar with the religious types, probably the most famous one of the last 20 years, primarily due to a lot of news reporting and research as well, is an Islamic ideology as a motivation for terrorism, primarily based on a moral belief in the need to eliminate or to fight all those that do not fit with our interpretation of the religious approach in Islam, for that matter. There was also a Christian motivation for violence and terrorism, a belief that certain races based on religious composition are more worthy than others. A Christian ideology has guided the group Turner Diaries, which operated in the United States in the late 1970s. Also, Timothy McVeigh, which was the perpetrator of the attack in Oklahoma City in 1995, was a loose follower of this approach. And finally, let's not forget the Jewish people, of course. The Kach movement operated in Israel, especially during the 1980s and the early 1990s, mostly promoted a doctrine that called to turn Israel into a theocracy. And then according to that approach, all Arabs, regardless of their religious or national affiliation, are viewed as enemies. One of the famous followers of this approach was Dr. Baruch Goldstein, which in February of 1994 entered the cave of the Patriarch in Hebron and massacred over 25 Palestinian Islamic worshippers, which led to a cycle of violence in Israel afterwards. Yigal Amir, which was a law student in Israel, follower of this approach, of this Jewish interpretation, the Kach movement, assassinated former Prime Minister Rabin in 1994 because of the way that they interpret the way that he behaves in his negotiations with Palestinians and a lot of concessions. So all different religions, especially the big monotheistic one, offer us kind of a basic idea for motivation for terrorism. All right, let's go back to our structure of the lecture. Some of the assumptions for the ideological approach. Unlike the strategic approach, preferences matter. We care what are the origins of preferences. What kind of belief system and where it comes from will justify the use of violence. So it's going to make terrorism as a desirable method. At the same time, we are agnostic when it comes to the unit of analysis. So it can be an individual ideology. It can be a group belief system. It doesn't really matter in this case. And third, we're focusing on beliefs as a motivator or as a driver of radicalization and why individuals and groups become violent. As part of a cosmic and collective struggle based on those belief systems, require personal sacrifice, places a lot of the emphasis on the afterlife and the need to satisfy an authority which is beyond human, especially in the case, of course, of religious ideology. Before I go into the implications part of that approach, I will stop for today's attendance word. Attendance word for today will be the word triangle. Triangle. That's going to be attendance word for today. So, what are the implications of this approach? One, an extreme belief, an extreme ideology is more likely, or an extreme interpretation of this ideology is more likely to motivate more violence. For the secular types of groups, secular ideologies, the audience in most cases was the public within the area where they operated. And the goal was to correct society, whether it is the Marxist view, whether it is the suprematist view, the idea is to correct the order of society. For the religious groups, the audience is not the public, it's a supernatural audience, God for each one of the interpretations of those religions. And the goal is not to correct the society, but to change the system overall. That means that those kinds of groups, the religious types of group, will target anyone who's not a believer, who's not part of our group, of the way that we interpret those religious texts, which makes religious groups a lot more deadly. Second, an ideological interpretation of terrorism, an ideological motivation for terrorism can provide us with some explanation for behavior which may be viewed as counterproductive from a strategic standpoint. Why? Because we're motivated by ideology. There's a very famous story about ISIS fighting over a specific village in Syria and losing a lot of its fighters and devoting a lot of resources and energy to take control of that village, because in their interpretation of the Quran and some of the arguments made by the Prophet, that village had a very important role. So they devoted a lot of resources for that and lost a lot of people for that. So that's not really productive from a strategic standpoint, but it can be explained based on these ideology. Also in the context of ISIS, in most of the areas where they took control in the northern parts of Syria and Iraq, because of the way that they interpret the Quran, they banned smoking in public areas. And that had substantial negative effect for the amount of public support they had. Again, it's not productive. It's counterproductive from a rational standpoint. It can easily be explained based on their ideology. Okay? Third is the idea that violence based on this interpretation is used for the sake of violence. There's evidence from a survey conducted in Lebanon that collected information from a Shiite terrorists in Lebanon, and many of them have argued that their goal was to serve God by committing those kinds of acts. So they did not argue they have any kind of political goal or they wanted to recruit public support for the political goal. Their goal was to satisfy this supernatural authority, and that's why they engaged in violence. So in that case, violence is used for the sake of violence, not for any other goal. Okay? All right. Some of the criticisms, first of all, I'm sure you heard that point, but it's important to think about it in that context. Correlation is not causation. The fact that an individual, a terrorist, has some kind of a belief system does not mean that that is the cause. Not all Jewish terrorists are motivated by their religious belief. Not all Islamic individuals that engage in terrorism are motivated by that belief. Maybe they are motivated by another belief, a nationalistic one, a secular one, maybe just organizational one. There may be other things. It's very hard to establish ideology as a cause in that case. Second ideology is unobserved. How can we observe ideology and classify it? How can we unpack Christian belief, saying those sects of Christian belief are more likely to be violent, engage in terrorism compared to those interpretation or those subgroups, right? It's very, very complicated. Third, is ideology in this case a motivation for terrorism or just a post hoc justification? It's possible that an individual will decide to engage in terrorism because he was a member of a group that faced a lot of pressure from other groups. So maybe it fits actually to the organizational explanation, but this doesn't sound really as a very devoted goal. So that individual, if he's not dead, let's say, after the attack that he conducted, will adopt the ideology post hoc to say, yeah, I did it because I believe in that, whatever that is. So it's hard to show that ideology was the motivation, was the cause, and not just recruited post hoc. And lastly, the policy implications, if we were following this approach to explain why individuals would join terrorism, have a lot of moral issues. First and foremost, they lead to profiling individuals. We will not allow entry of Muslims into the United States because all of them are potential terrorists. That's a very problematic policy based on this kind of view. We will track the cell phones of specific individuals that has certain social beliefs because they may be terrorists. That has substantial privacy and moral issues. Any kind of policy solution based on those kinds of views is very, very problematic, right? So as I mentioned briefly, and then when I first talked about, terrorism is a very, very vast topic. This is just the tip of the iceberg of that. And if you want to read more, you're more than welcome to read more as always. On Wednesday, I'll talk more about that, and I'll use those different approaches also to think about the idea of countering terrorism. How do we respond to terrorism? And I remind you once again, if you have questions regarding the final project, paper, and presentation, use office hours. That's why I'm there for, to come and help you with that. And with that, I'm done for today, and I will see you all on Wednesday. Goodbye, everyone.